Each year, Microsoft Research hosts hundreds of influential speakers from around the world, including leading scientists, renowned experts in technology, book authors, and leading academics, and makes videos of these lectures freely available.
Start the morning with a talk about Z3, that's a theorem prover. And I'd like to introduce my colleague Christoph Wintersteiger, who is a researcher here in the Programming Principle and Tools group. So he will talk about Z3 basically. And one thing to note is that just recently the Z3 project achieved the ACM Systems Software Systems Award. So that's a great recognition for the work.
Thank you. Right, welcome. Good morning, everybody. So I'm going to tell you about C3, which is the project that I spend most of my time on. And it's used in many other procedures as well. So as Carl said, C3 is a theorem prover. So it takes theorems as an input, and it will output whether these theorems are true or false. It's important to note that this is completely precise, logically precise. In other areas, like in machine learning, you also see models that are to some degree true and to some other degree false. Here it's always a clear thing, completely logically derivable. And that is used in many verification style applications. And it came out of software verification, of course, especially at Microsoft. But general verification is now used in other areas as well, wherever precise decisions are needed. And for this talk, I'm going to talk about C3 in general a little bit, what an SMT solver is, what a theorem prover is, what subsolvers are, just to make sure everybody understands the terminology. And I'll then show you two projects that I've recently worked on and I still work on. One of them from computational biology, more or less just to show you that this kind of technique is also useful in other areas, not just in software verification. And then I'll talk about floating point arithmetic, which is the latest part of mathematics that was added to the SMT standard. And it's a particularly tricky theory. So globally, this is an application of C3, and I'll show you how to apply what you can expect from that. And this is a part inside of C3. So if you find yourself working on verification-related problems, you might very well be interested in setting up an application that uses C3. Or if you're more mathematically inclined, you might think about working inside of C3 on new theories, new decision procedures, and so on. So here's a very coarse overview. When you talk about verification technology, I mean, of course, that there is some piece of software that we call a verifier in the middle, which takes as input a program and some sort of specification, and maybe a set of properties, maybe a type of property. Maybe we want to check that programs don't segfault, things like that. The verifier will then spend some time analyzing the program and the specification, and if we're lucky, after some time, it will return either a bug, it will show us what that bug looks like, how to get there, or it will say, okay, there's no bugs in the program, everything's okay, and sometimes it can also give us a proof of that. Typically, in practical settings, and also research settings, what these verifiers look like, they're a high-level strategy that decomposes the big verification problem into many small problems, which are then usually dispatched through some sort of formal reasoning engine. So the red part down here is really pure mathematics. It's proving theorems, and the verifier will set up those theories. Maybe they are verification conditions. Right, and then this formulation is in fact then the one that finds the bug descriptions, which come out on the top right. And sometimes it's also this method that finds a mathematical proof of correctness. Right, so in general, in formal verification, there are many difficult problems. First and foremost, of course, that there are loops or recursion in programs, which makes it very hard to reason about them. Not necessarily hard because it's just hard to think about it, but because it takes a lot of time to analyze things like that. And in fact, sometimes it takes infinite time when problems are undecidable. In that case, we could just not expect any answer at all. There's also non-determinism, which is everywhere in programs whenever you have an input to a function that is not fixed to some number yet, or generally when you have infinite loops, when you have all kinds of things. So the objective in formal verification for most verification tools is that the high-level verifier gets rid of all the difficult problems in some way or other, and then it generates a large set of relatively simple problems, which are then dispatched by the formal reasoning engine. For example, we can think of removing loops from programs. Maybe there's a for loop in there, and we just look at 3 iterations of that loop, not the whole loop in general, and then we end up with a problem that doesn't have loops. Of course, there are implications on the higher level then as well. The reasoning engine then takes these simpler problems and it checks whether these are satisfiable, which I'll explain. What that means, I'll explain on the next slide. And it's that engine that finds some sort of bug description, if there is one, and passes that on to the verifier. Today, this is not completely, the separation between verifier and the reasoning engine is not that clear. Some theorem provers and SMT solvers also support quantifiers, recursive foreign clauses, and things like that. So essentially, they can model check a whole program as well. Right. So what we need to know is the term satisfiability, what that means. In general, it is just some formula in some logic that you can think of, and we need to find out whether the variables in that formula can be set to some value so that the final output becomes true. For example, if we have propositional logic, we might have a formula like the one over here. I have to use the mouse to point. Give me a second. This formula over here, A and B might be Boolean variables, so they can only be true or false. And we need to find out whether there is a satisfying assignment, which in this case is very easy, of course. If you set A to 1 and B to 0, then this formula becomes true. For those not used to those symbols, the V shape means OR. So we need to make sure that either A or B is true. That's what that means. And that's a very useful formalism. It can give us very simple problem descriptions, which are still hard to analyze. This is pretty much the canonical NP-complete problem. In practice, we would like a little bit more. We don't want just Boolean variables. We want some other variables, like maybe integers, as in the lower problem. When x and y are integers, we can set them to 1 and 2, for example, to make this formula true as the result state. So we'd also like to reason about integers and real numbers and maybe arrays that are carrying programs and so on. And in general, that would be, in most cases, it's enough to look at first-order formulas. And then we need to find values for the variables, but of course the values depend on what theory is being used. And in the background, there's also interpretations for function and predicates, but that's getting into too much detail for this talk. So what is SMT? If we have just general first-order formulas, then that's a very hard thing to handle. General theorem prover, there have been theorem provers for a long time, and they try to do that, but it's not often, usually not possible to get a fully automated system. In usual theorem provers, there's a lot of human involvement. You need to write the structure of the proof down. Yeah, if you need to calculate 10,000 examples, for example, that's something the computer can do for you, but it won't come up with the proof strategy. So in Satisfiability Modulo Theories, the basic idea is to split first-order logic into various sub-theories and then to reason only in those theories. And only after we're done with that, we try to combine the results, which might trigger another iteration. So the Satisfiability Modulo Theories stands for the SMT community and the SMT library and the SMT standard, all of which are maintained and extended. And the standard and the library defines a set of theories that we can handle, that we would like to handle. And down here is a list of all the theories that are currently in that standard. So we can have Booleans, we can have uninterpreted functions, integers, both linear and nonlinear, real numbers, of course. And on the right-hand side, there are bit vectors and arrays and floating point numbers. Bit vectors are simply modular integers, basically, which occur in low-level C programs all the time, for example. And the most recent addition to that is floating point numbers, which I'm going to talk about in the last part of my talk. And the ones in brackets on the bottom right, some of those are supported by some solvers as an extension to the standard already. Data types and strings are currently being fed into the standard, so that will soon be a formal definition of those theories. Probabilities, it's in very early stages. Right, so yeah, but if you reason about these theories separately, when you get some result for each of those theories, then we need to combine the results, so there needs to be some sort of theory combination strategy, and I'll mention two a little bit later. The SMT library also contains a large set of benchmarks, a very large set in fact, and there's also an annual competition on who's the fastest in some of those theories. So that's basically the research agenda for that whole area. The basic idea is to split it up into small pieces, and everybody does one piece, and then we connect all the results, literally at runtime, but also in research. Right. So yes, just terminology. If we have a machine that decides about the satisfiability of Boolean or propositional formulas, that's called a SAT solver. SAT is just an abbreviation for satisfiability. And SMT solvers are, as I said before, satisfiability modulo theories. So they check first order formulas split up into smaller theories. Where decidable, they will try to do that. But also where they're undecidable, they will try to get as many results as we still can. And that also includes propositional formulas. So we don't need to use both of them at the same time. But we can if we want to. And as I mentioned, the aim is full automation. Especially in software verification, it's very nice to have a completely automated tool that every time you check your code into some sort of versioning system, or even when you compile it, checks the program, and without the intervention of the programmer, it finds the bugs or it proves that it doesn't have any bugs. But that's a very tall order, because many of these problems are undecidable, so we won't ever be able to do that on a large scale. But we're still trying to get as far as we can. Right. So the particular formal reasoning engine that I work on is called SAT3. It's the third generation of the SAT verification tools. And it's an SMT solver, so it can reason about all these different theories, and it supports all of the ones that are defined right now. It's also a sort of theorem prover by support of sub-goals and tactics and probes that you can apply to your goals. And that way, you can implement the proof structure yourself if you think you have a better one than the automated prover. But I think the best way of thinking about that piece of software is that it's a collection of decision procedures for various fragments of first-order logic. And it grows all the time. There's new decision procedures added all the time. There's new code, new algorithms are implemented, and so on. And it's also completely open source now. That wasn't always the case, but now it is. It's on an MIT license, so it's completely free to use. And you can see the code at GitHub. Okay, so here's just a very basic idea of what SMT solvers do and how they achieve the separation into separate logics. Suppose we have an input formula, like first of all, let's define the variables. Let's say the red variables up there, x and y, are bit vector variables, maybe of size 32, and z is an integer, positive or negative. And here's a formula that we have to decide. We need to find a solution to x equals y and z is not equal to 1. And I've colored these atoms in different colors to show that the left-hand side, the left part of this formula contains only bit vector variables, and the right part contains only integer variables. So it's relatively straightforward to separate these atoms in so we can run with the reasoning engine just for those theories. But in general, what we do is we first run a SAT solver that's either integrated or not. And that SAT solver will decide for us which of the atoms in the input formula are being analyzed right now. So we replace x equals y by just a new Boolean variable, that's q, and z not equal to 1 is replaced by another variable called r. And in the background, we remember that q and r stand for these atoms here. That's why this is grayed out, where you just keep that in the background. So if the SAT solver tells us, well, set q and r to true, so this formula is satisfied, and that means we need to satisfy these both constraints here, but since they're colored in only one color, sorry, something's going wrong here. We can run the theory reasoners for those two separately. So we have a bit vector reasoning here that just sets both these variables to 0, and it doesn't need to know about z in any way because it doesn't depend. The semantics don't depend on anything. Sorry, something's going wrong here. Right, so in this case, we can actually find a satisfying assignment very easily, and we can just set z to 2 and the other ones to 0. So that way we achieve complete separation. We have a SAT solver that gets rid of the Boolean structure of the formula first, and then we have separate theory reasons that dispatch all the theory dependencies. And then it gets a bit more tricky when we need to combine those theories. So that there can be terms in this formula, like the one on the bottom right here, that contain variables from both or from two theories. For example, the output of a function might be a conversion of an integer to a bit vector or the other way around. And then we need to talk about theory combination. If we don't find a solution, if the B or Z theory there don't find solutions, then we can also backtrack and ask for a new assignment from the SAT solver here. So it selects a different subset of the atoms that need to be satisfied then. Right. And if something doesn't work out, we also can learn lemmas. That way we can sort of keep track of progress. We can also throw away the progress. So it's a bit like a cache. But that kind of cache gives us exponential speed bumps sometimes. So it's a very important cache. Right, yeah, theory combination does basically two strategies to do that. One of them is a rather old one from 1979. It's the Nelson-Oppen theory combination, which essentially computes the equality for all variables. So it, when some variable is set to some value, then other variables might be equal to that particular variable, and then it tries to generate all these equalities and adds them to the formula. That's sort of pessimistic because it always generates all these equalities upfront before you check whether you actually need them. So there's also model-based theory combination then, which tries to do exactly that. It tries not to add all the equalities, but just the ones that we really need. So it's sort of a pessimistic variant versus an optimistic strategy for those. And on one particular input, one of them might be better than the others. But currently in software verification problems, for example, the optimistic one works much better. So that's enough of the theory about that. There's, of course, also a bunch of applications of Z3. And these are all project names from various parts of Microsoft. The slide is a little bit old, so some latest names may not be in there yet. And there's also a bunch of projects from Cambridge here, for example, Slayer and Terminator and F-star over there. These are from here. And recently, there's also been applications in computational biology. These are 3 project names of projects here in Cambridge. And some of the people involved in those might actually be in the room. So if you want to talk about those, there's plenty of people around. And, right. Now, I'm going to show you one of these applications here. In computational biology, the type of reasoning that's done is also verification. But yeah, the inputs are slightly different. And in fact, it is such that programs are essentially everywhere. Of course, programs are written by programmers and software engineers and so on. But increasingly, formalisms from computer science are also being used in other areas that have similar models of computation to describe dynamic behavior of systems. So if we think about physics, for example, lots of systems are modeled using some kind of differential equation, ordinary or partial or anything else. And these are, in fact, programs as well. They may be continuous time, but they're also programs. In general, in any area where we try to get an abstraction of naturally occurring behavior, like in biology when we want to find out what some sort of organism does or how it grows when it dies. Also in chemistry, describing chemical reactions in a formal mathematical way has been done for the last 100 years. And in fact, if you look at those strategies that are used in chemistry, they're very similar to programming models. And of course in biology, where it's particularly hard to find out what's happening in nature because you can't always measure it precisely or precise enough. and you can't really do all the experiments that you would like to because everything is just too small or too unpredictable or too much noise or too much measurement error. It's very hard to find a formal description of what's happening in an organism without actually being able to squeeze the thing. Right. And of course, the programs are also in computer science. And in general, in all these areas where program or program-like model descriptions are used, automated reasoning is really the most important thing at the moment. We've reached a stage where these models are not trivial anymore, and they're quickly getting too large for any kind of manual analysis. Examples of that might be, in physics, for example, these differential equations have seen lots of methods in practice and in research for finding out whether there are attractors like this one up there in the picture in the system. The starting value problem for differential equations has always been around, and it's been worked on for about 100 years as well, or even longer actually in physics. And these are, there are lots of kinds of properties. The properties are usually a little bit different from area to area. For example, in a biological model, you might ask, can the system grow forever? Usually the answer is no. But it might be yes if we feed it infinitely large amounts of food. And of course, that also works for populations, not just single things. The picture on the bottom right is a picture of a DNA computation model. I think it's an AND gate implemented in DNA strings. The red and green and blue parts are particular parts of DNA strings that can react with each other. There's these two-hole domains going. Where's the mouse? I'm sorry, I have to use the mouse, otherwise the video is not going to capture it. That's fine. So there's these two-hole domains going upwards from the long strings. That's where we are. There are short two-hole domains, and there are long complementary strings. And these two-holes can bind to each other, so they're complementary, so they can bind to each other, and then you get even longer strings, and then you can build all kinds of longer strings. And that way you can also do arbitrary kinds of computation. And that's a very interesting topic right now. And since this is so closely related to computer programs, people are really interested in doing both modeling of existing models, systems, but also constructing systems. DNA systems are really nice interfaces to the human computer, essentially. So you can actually inject them into blood and achieve some goals through that. So we can do both. We can actually do biological computation with those, but also we can effect the biological computation that's going on in nature. And as I said, so just yesterday, for example, I was talking to someone about this DNA model down there, and these three reactions are already incredibly hard to analyze. For example, predicting when this kind of system has finally computed the output is an incredibly hard problem. It depends on the number of molecules you have in the input. It depends on how much there is overall, all these kinds of things, and that makes it very hard to analyze. Of course, all kinds of verification technology is used in this area, but not only for verification purposes. It's also about system exploration and system optimization. Optimization means that we want a small, understandable model, right? Otherwise, we don't really understand it. And the other thing is, we don't really know what properties are true of any kind of system. For example, all the properties that we use in software verification, for example, to check against seg faults, are useless in biology. There's no seg faults in biology, right? So that kind of property doesn't immediately apply. But on the biologists don't really know how to write down a property. They're not mathematicians or even less logicians. So they might be able to tell you qualitatively what they kind of feel and expect. And then we need to go back to them and say, how do we formalize that, make a proposal for that? And that's where we get into system exploration. So we need to take the computational model and to explain it to biologists, and then they can come back to us and say what's wrong and what's good and what's bad. Right, and one such formalism is gene regulatory networks, and there's been quite a lot of work on applying verification technology to gene regulatory networks, and there's also synthesis technology. And I'm going to show you a small example of synthesis on the next few slides. So just to give you an idea, if you've never seen a gene regulatory network, it's essentially Boolean variables, like A, B, and C are down there, that depend on each other. It's discrete time, so you do one step every clock tick, and then you just compute the next state functions of each of those genes from the inputs. So B, for example, down here, depends on two repressors and two activators, and there's some hidden Boolean function somewhere that tells us whether B is true or false, depending on other genes. It could depend on all the other ones in the system. It can even depend on itself, like C does over there. And the functions would look something like this. There's a logical Boolean function that, well, if gene A is on and the C gene is off, then we get some output. So it's a very simple formalism. It's very easy to understand for computer scientists, but also small enough to be understood by non-experts like biologists. And actually, also, this formalism, I think, was proposed in the 60s already, 60s or 70s, so it's really old. And then here's a sort of gross overview of what the essential bio-computational problems are. Like I said, there's analysis and verification tasks where we want to find out that what happens when a gene regulatory network is actually put into nature and it runs. Then, of course, we would like to influence that kind of behavior, either to make scientific experiments or to actually cure an illness or something like that. So we're also interested in knocking genes out. For example, we might want to make sure that some particular gene in the system is always on from now on, or it's always off so it can't trigger cancer or something like that. And so usually the setup is the question that if we start from some known initial state, which might not be a single state, but it might be a set of states, for example, because we know the size of our Petri dish and we know how much of some particular chemical we inject. And so on. But then we would like to know if we let that system run by itself and we look at it some time later, what should we expect? What does the system do? What kind of final states can it be and so on. And that's all of this is very good for constructed problems that biologists or computer scientists make up. But then in nature, to understand natural systems, we also need synthesis. So we can propose the hypothesis that all organisms can be described by Boolean networks, which is probably not true, but that is an assumption we can start from. Then we still don't know the system for one particular organisms. But we have experimental data. We can just have lots of animals and we just measure some kind of data and then we try to find a model that matches that data. Today, or also in the recent past, that's done by either machine learning techniques or by manual human learning machines. There's somebody who sits there and goes through all the experiments and then makes up a model that he thinks is true. Both these approaches are not precise. So there's usually some discrepancy between experimental data and the model that we come up with. Either because it's just too hard, or the machine learning technique that we use is not strong enough to describe all kinds of behaviors. For example, decision trees might not be able to capture infinitely many levels of concentration of some chemical. And like I said, when we make that assumption that some system can be described by a Boolean network, we can also make other assumptions and describe it by other models, like chemical reaction networks, for example, gene regulatory networks, the DNA string computation, and so on. There's lots of different models, and there's some of them are coming from computer scientists, some of them are coming from biologists, and they're sort of trying to find the right level of abstraction for answering particular kinds of questions. So here's a very practical example. This is, on the bottom left here, that's a paper about a model for sea urchins. Sea urchins are these animals up there. They live in the sea and they're totally spiky like a hedgehog. And that's one of the organisms that's very often used to do some kind of biological analysis, because it's relatively small and simple, but still large enough to get good answers. And for this paper, the authors, which are different from us, we didn't know them before, came up with a model of a gene regulatory network, like the one on the top right here. That's actually a part of a screenshot from their model. And it's basically a big list of genes and the dependencies of them. All these colored lines indicate dependencies of genes on other genes. And then on top of that picture, there's also a list of Boolean functions that actually implements those behaviors. Now, the model that they came up with was already using, they came up with by using some sort of simulation techniques. But they basically ran a bunch of simulations, and then they checked whether the experimental traces match with the traces that they get from the wet lab. So it's a sort of already computational, but not strong enough. And the model that they had in the end, that did not actually explain large parts of the data. For example, they couldn't find any update functions that would match the data for 6 out of those 45 genes in the system. And 25 other genes had obvious discrepancies with the experimental data. And in some cases, they actually tried to patch it. An example is this kind of function that says, this gene here, WNT8, sorry, I have to stay here. This gene WNT8 depends on other stuff, but we need to make sure that between 18 hours and 24 hours after we start the experiment, that it's not on. So that's a total hack. There's no information in that. It just says, oh, in our experimental data, we saw that it's always off between those times. That's not really much you can learn from that. So those we would like to get rid of course. How do we do that? Well, we take all the experimental data. That's a schematic representation of the growth of the sea urchin. It starts here. That's a fertilization, 6 hours post-fertilization. And it goes on, and these areas of the organism starts to shift around. Now here it's basically adult. And the authors were nice enough to give us all the traces from the simulator that they got, and they put that into the big table there, and the red color means the gene is on, and the gray means it's off. And there's a few other annotations there. And of course, we can encode that into a mathematical constraint very easily. We just say, oh, ALX gene 1 is set to 0 at time point 1. That's what the brackets mean. That's a time specification. And then we can try to see whether we can find a simple set of formulas that describes that behavior. So how do we do that? First, we can observe that there's always a finite number of genes, and they're only on or off, so they're just Boolean. And the update functions are also Boolean functions. In this particular model, there's also some simple variants of temporal operators. But if we don't know what it means, it doesn't matter. It's just for the logicians in here. And then we heavily constrain the possible scape of the functions in the computational experiment. So we're not looking for arbitrary functions, but we're actually just looking for functions that make biological sense, more or less. So we had somebody with experience on modeling biological systems on this project, and they were able to sort of tell us what nature would produce, sort of, what they've seen in other models, what they've experienced before in other experiments. Right, so everything's finite. We have discrete and finite time. It's all Boolean values, Boolean functions, so that's very easily encodable into a formula that uses bit vector variables and also uninterpreted functions if we want arbitrary functions in there. And we have fairly efficient, relatively efficient decision procedures for that, which means we can actually ask the solver to select out of these simple functions some functions that happen to replicate the experimental traces that we saw in the wet lab experiment. So we can do that, and it runs about overnight, and then it spits out some functions. And in this case, we were actually able to fix all the problematic behaviors. So the system still does exactly the same that it did in the wet lab experiments, but there are no discrepancies under these in those functions, between those functions and the wet lab experiments. And it's also consistent with 3 different kinds of perturbations of the system. Perturbation means something like a knockdown or a knockup. We actively try to modify the system so we can see what happens if we make that kind of modification. So it also works with that. And we did that by finding 25 new update functions, which then both simulate and logically check. Okay. Now there's an example down here. If you don't know what all this means, that's totally fine. But for the experts, you can see that these at 3 means 3 time steps in the past. Some gene was on, and the V2 measure over there means it's one of those colored regions. It's only the yellow region and not the other ones. And this rather complicated function here, we could slightly simplify, so it even looks better now, and it also replicates all the experimental results that we wanted to represent. So that's all very nice, and we can write a very good verification paper on how to verify these systems and how to synthesize functions. But we have no idea about the quality of those kinds of functions in practice. So this could be grossly overfitting onto the experimental data, and it's not going to match anything that we will see in experiments in the future. So it's a bit like machine learning is trying to get closer and closer to the actual result. Well, this is sort of backwards from top. We try to get all the answers first, and then we try to refine when we see new experiments later. And in this particular case, we're now going back to the original authors of the paper, and we'll see what they think of our functions that we found. We think they're pretty much biologically meaningful, but we will see what they have to say. And of course, since we did that work, they also came up with new experiments. So that immediately gives you a very nice check for your procedure. If your model that you found also matches with the new experimental data that the biologists found recently, then that's sort of like a cross-validation test. And it sort of tells, if all the functions are wrong, they don't match the new experimental data, then obviously the quality of the model was not very good before, and the other way around. Okay, so that's what we can do with biological models, which is an application of set 3, or of general mathematical reasoning. And for the rest of the talk, I'll tell you about floating point arithmetic, which is the latest addition to the SMT standard set of theories. This is more on the computer side, the computer science side of applications here. Floating point numbers are used in lots of programs, and especially also in simulators that are used in other sciences. For example, our computational biology group also has a very nice simulator for all kinds of biological models. And that, for performance reasons, uses floating point numbers everywhere to abstract mathematical real numbers. And it's very tempting to think of floating point numbers as an implementation of real numbers on a computer, and that's what many programmers actually do. But that has implications that are very much unexpected later on. Just to get everybody on the same page, this here is a summary of what the theory actually contains. Variables are named, and they're of types like float and double, which I'm sure all of you have seen in computer programs. And there's not just floats and doubles, there's also half floats and double and quadruple precision, and larger and larger. In general, we can have any kind of floating point number depending on two numbers for the size of the mantissa and the size of the exponent. And then we have a bunch of operations on them, addition, subtraction, multiplication, and so on. I've highlighted the percent and FMA, which are particularly hard operations to analyze. The percent sign is, of course, a remainder operation, which has tricky semantics in floating point logic. And FMA stands for fused multiplier, so it's a multiplication plus an addition in one operation, with no rounding in between. So it's a more precise version of just doing a multiplication and an addition. There's also a bunch of special values like plus minus 0. And yes, there's actually two kinds of 0 here for symmetry reasons, not so much for mathematical ones. There's also plus minus infinity for when the floating point numbers are not large enough to hold whatever results we're looking for. And there's NaN for not a number, for divisions by 0, for example, and a couple others. In the latest standard, the IEEE standard for floating point numbers, there are also 5 rounding modes called ties toward odd, ties toward even, and so on. To negative to positive is sort of self-explanatory. Ties toward odd means if the result is exactly 0.5, so it's, sorry, is that me? Oh no, that was you. Okay. So ties to or odd means when the result of a floating point operation is exactly 0.5, 0, 0, 0, and so on. Then the tie is broken by rounding to the odd number that's closest. And there's also the converse one for even numbers. The representation of variables is split up like this. We have a single sign bit, usually. Some bits for exponents and some bits for significant. Usually the size of the significant is larger than the exponent. And for example, double precision floating point numbers are 64 bits in total. There's one sign bit, there's 11 exponent bits and 52 significant bits. And that represents a real number as described by the formula underneath the colored box. As I said, these are used as approximations of the real numbers, but programmers are not always aware of the fact that they're actually just abstractions. They're not real numbers. But the semantics of operations is, of course, defined close to that of real numbers. But in cases where the representation is not precise enough to represent the result that we are looking for, we have to round to some. So it's usually something like that. The definition of what floating point addition means, depending on some rounding mode and inputs A and B, is the actual mathematical addition, but then rounded according to the rounding mode. This kind of theory gives us, presents tricky verification problems. These kinds of floating point numbers and all kinds of arithmetic over it occur in programs that we would like to verify. But because of the tricky semantics of floating point numbers, it's very hard to do. And when you have a particular program to verify, even if the actual mathematical procedure is very simple, it can still take a lot of time to actually find a satisfying assignment or a proof over these numbers, just because we have to take care of all those special cases. We have 6 special values like plus and minus infinity to check whether any of that could be the case. And then we have 64 bits that we need to assign in some way that represents a real number. And in fact, just the implementation of the rounding algorithm is incredibly tricky. And there are some operations which are not even implemented on some CPUs. For example, the remainder operation, that's the percent here, is not actually implemented on any CPU because the circuit for that would be way too large. It would make the CPU too expensive and large, and it would lose too much temperature and so on. So yeah, it's all very hard to verify. There's, of course, new error bounds on all the variables through the rounding. So, and even if rounding never really occurs, we can't be sure of that. We don't have a proof of that up front. So we have to take that possibility into account at every step. There's all kinds of unintuitive and unexpected results. For example, when the error bounds get too large, you might get numbers out there that you thought are not even close to the range of what you're doing. And there's also completely unexpected results where something becomes negative that you were absolutely sure that it was positive, that kind of stuff. It lacks nice mathematical properties, which is one of the causes of these unexpected results. For example, multiplication is not associative anymore, which is a thing that we intuitively always assume. And there are lots of special cases which are either not documented at all or not really in the standard. The IEEE standard for floating point numbers was sort of designed after the CPUs came out. So it's all not completely the same. And one example, one really tricky example, is the minimum operation on the bottom, in the bottom line here. What is the minimum of -0 and +0? Somebody has to decide, but none of them is really good. But what the CPUs actually do is completely unexpected, and what they return in this case is the second argument. So the result of this is +0, and if you swap the operands, the result is -0. And that's one of those cases that I personally, for example, did not know. I was completely surprised to see a weird semantic like that. They must have had some reason for that, and the possibly the reason is that that's 1 clock cycle faster in a CPU, because you don't have to compare the numbers. You just take the second one. So yeah, all this kind of stuff can happen. You have to take account of that. Here's an example of a floating point program that implements some sort of so I have to say here again. This implements a controller that reads some inputs. Here it reads some inputs, and it wants to steer the system towards some set point the set point is set to 20.0 up there. So it reads the input from some sensor. It then computes how far it is away from the set point. That's the error variable here. And then it keeps in the background an integral over the last few values that it has seen. And depending on that, it makes the system go faster or slower towards the set point. So in the end, it outputs some sort of control signal in blue here that makes the system go that way, the way it wants. So what happens when, in the beginning, we know that the sensor will always deliver some result between 18 and 22? Okay. Maybe those are temperatures, for example, and we know that in the setting that our system is running in, is always going to be in that temperature range. So if you assume that, can we then conclude that the output control signal will always be between -3 and +3? Well, that's really hard to tell, and it depends on all those numbers that are up on the top, the Kp, the Ki, and so on. And in this example, we try to implement the controller using only double variables, so that's 64-bit floating point numbers. Okay. Now the first problem is the loop in there, right? And we can get rid of the loop very easily by just making lots of small problems that have a fixed n. In the beginning, we look at 0 loop iterations, and we look at 1 loop iteration. We try to increase that number until we find a problem where the output is actually outside of the range that we wanted to see. Or we try some more involved proving processes to conclude from some number of iterations of the loop that it must always hold for all the loops by doing some sort of induction proof. Yes?
In this case, what's the value of R?
The value of f.
R. I think R is different from error, right?
Sorry, I can't see an f.
R.
Oh, error. Oh, yeah.
That's the error. The integral equals integral plus error line.
In the next line.
Next line. Oh, sorry. Yeah, that's a typo. Yeah, that means error, of course. Yeah. The original paper that I took that from didn't have enough margin. So yeah, that's the error. You compute the error that's currently in the system, how far you're away from the set point, and the integral tells you how far away you were in the last few iterations, and that helps you to slow down the system so it doesn't react too quickly. Right. So let's suppose we got rid of the loops by just looking at one fixed number of loop iterations. Also, there's no quantifiers in here. And maybe we have some sort of good approximation technique that is not really precise, but can get us results that are relatively close to what we might want to see. We can also convert any of those floating point problems into a bit vector problem, which we can then in turn translate into a SAT problem. It's just a big SAT problem with Boolean variables. And we're in a very simple formalism, and we have relatively efficient procedures for solving those formulas. So that way we can put the problem into some convenient form. If we like to reason about floating point numbers directly, we can leave it there. If we prefer bit vectors, we can move it there, and so on. Precise techniques for solving these formulas exist, as I will show you in the next few slides. But they're mainly based on bit blasting. That's exactly translation to Boolean variables. You just blast it into a huge Boolean formula. And it's relatively expensive, not so much because the decision procedures are not efficient enough, but because the problems become very, very big very quickly. And in fact, we have a graph here that shows us exactly that. As we increase the number of loop iterations from 20 to 30 and so on, the number of variables increases only linearly. The number of clauses also increases linearly, but much higher than the number of variables. So here we're up to 10 million clauses in the system. So even a very efficient SAT solver will have to take some time to chew on that. And since that it's an NP-complete problem and there's no tricks involved, so we're not solving anything very fast, we're not violating any laws, we can actually see that exponential increase in runtime. If we measure for each of those problems that we got here, we measure how long C3, for example, takes to solve it, and then we see that for 30 loop iterations, that's about an hour of runtime. And of course, if you try to unroll it longer and longer, it will go up and up and up. So this is not going to work for very long. It only works for very simple problems. So what we did recently was we came up with an approximation framework general approximation and abstraction frameworks are very popular in all kinds of verification projects and approaches. What we did in this case is we took the original problem, that's big phi on the bottom here. Or maybe I should explain the whole thing. We are looking for a model M that entails, interpreted over some theory T, the formula phi. So M is a solution to phi, essentially. But like I just said before, these problems become very big when we translate them into Z. So we want to do some sort of approximation where we lift the formula phi into some phi hat, which has some kind of relation with the original phi. And usually in other verification frameworks, it means that a phi implies phi hat. So there's a clear logical relationship between those two. And if this one implies that way, then we can also go the error back down. If we find a model for the implied formula, that model can also be translated into an original. And there are approaches for that in other theories, but also in floating point theory. But what we wanted to do is really to use some incomplete algorithms because they're usually much faster, and we had the intuition that they might deliver results that are close to real precise results. So the idea was not to use an implication here, not to get an over-approximation or another approximation, but arbitrary experiment. We don't really know whether it's an over or under approximation. It's just something close. So the lifting is not an implication, and then the model reconstruction can fail. So sometimes there's no way to get a real model from, or by some simple algorithm, from the approximated model. And here's a slide for the theoreticians. We have some sort of theory and input problem. We add a new sort called the precision sort. That's SP over here. Precision sort. So every term in the formula is assigned some precision, and we know that there is a maximum precision called omega. And all the precisions are ordered, so something with a higher precision value is actually closer to a result intuitively as another one. And every term gets an additional argument, that's the precision. Or here's the simple representation as an example of a formula. The topmost one is just for reference. The tree represents that formula. And so this means equal y plus x, and so on. And like I said, we add a new argument to every term that tells us with what kind of precision we want to look at that particular term. For example, that means we can shift effort from multiplication to addition by treating addition more precisely than multiplication. So approximation, addition is usually relatively okay to analyze, but multiplication is really hard. So we can use many bits for the plus, we get precise results there, but we can use just a few bits on multiplication, so it gets about the same speed, but we can prove less things. Okay, and here's an observation about floating point numbers. And the observation is that small floating point numbers are always contained in big floating point numbers. So if we have some number of significant bits and some number of exponent bits, and then we move to a different floating point number which has more mantissa bits, more significant bits, and more exponent bits, then the numbers that can be represented, real numbers that can be represented by those floating point numbers, is always smaller. Yes, so the numbers with small significant exponent bit are always contained in the set of large numbers with large S prime and E prime. So that way we have a very trivial, very simple way of increasing the precision, right? You can just use small floating point numbers in the beginning, and if we find out that it wasn't precise enough, we can just add more and more bits. And that way we can grow the translation to the SAT problem by iteration. So we can actually get a small SAT problem in the end instead of a big one, and we increase it until we find a solution. Of course, sometimes it means that we have to go all the way and get the same big problem in the end. But for many problems, it turns out that we don't need field precision. We can just keep using small numbers. And that way we can build the following approximation framework where on the top we solve an approximation of the formula for which we get a model. That's what the SAT arrow means. And then we try to reconstruct a precise model from that model for the approximated formula, which, as I said, can fail. It doesn't have to fail, but sometimes it fails. If it doesn't fail, we get a model and we're done. And we have proved satisfiability of the formula. If the model reconstruction fails, then we can do some refinement. So we increase heuristically the precision of the terms which we think caused this abstraction problem. And that means we end up with a new approximate subproblem. If there is no solution to the approximation, then we can also do something that we call proof-guided approximation refinement. We can ask the SAT solver to deliver a proof, a resolution proof, of satisfiability or unsatisfiability in this case, for the approximation. And the easiest way to think about it is that all those bits of the formula that are referenced in that resolution proof are in some way involved in causing this unsatisfiability. So we can increase the precision for just those terms that are included in the proof. Right. So we search for an approximate model with precision assigned to some values. In our case, we start with floating point numbers of size 3 and 3. So there's 3 mantissa bits and 3 exponent bits. But we could also use other stuff. We could try optimizing the abstraction towards fewer occurrences of rounding or towards smaller values. We can use no exponent at all, just assume it's always 0. We could also try some other incomplete algorithm that existed for many times that translates to real numbers and then finds solutions on real numbers, which is also intuitively probably somewhat close. And there's all kinds of other things. So how does that work? Like I said, we assign a precision to every term. In the very beginning, we assign precision 0, which means we have only 6-bit floating point numbers. And then we try to find a model for that. Maybe it comes back with these numbers down here, 2.0 and 3.5 for x and y, which we then place into the original formula by setting all the precisions to omega. So this is maximum precision, so every term represents exactly what it was in the original problem. And now we propagate the numbers that we got on the experiment on the approximated formula and propagate it through the precise one. On the right-hand side part, nothing happens. Everything is fine, it just propagates. The interesting part is on the left here, where we try to add x and y together. So first we compute x plus 1.75, which is here. So we put 2.0 into x, and we add it up, because there's an addition here, with 1.75, meaning we get 3.75 as a result of this addition. And there we go. Yes, so that's a 3.5 up there. And the top constraint says we must be, right, so those two numbers must be equal. Y and 3.75 must be equal. But we had a model of 3.5 for y. So those two don't match up. We need to correct this one to 3.75. That's the precise model reconstruction. From the approximate model, which said 3.5, we now get a precise value of 3.75. And that doesn't change anything in the commented part on the right. So in this case, we were lucky, and we found a small model with just small numbers, small floating point numbers, very quickly. And what we use in the implementation to heuristically decide what kind of term to refine, where we increase the precision, we just compute the relative error between the precise model and the approximate model. That is all the red terms, the dependence on precision p. We compute the difference of that with the precise term where precision is omega. And then we just increase the precision of the highest ranked single term or multiple terms. And the actual error bounds are propagated from variables upwards through the expressions. So from children to parents, the error is computed for larger and larger expressions. Right, now proof-guided approximation refinement, I'm just mentioning that because we actually didn't implement it yet so far. So at the moment we just increase the precision for everything if something is not satisfiable. But of course there is a trade-off between precision and efficiency here, and this trivial refinement procedure for unsatisfiable approximations is not efficient in practice at all. But for now we were happy with SAT problems. So just some general argument. In this case, we actually use an existing decision procedure for the theory that we're trying to decide. And on top of that, we build an abstraction framework that makes the original procedure faster. And that's also a very common theme, not just in satisfiability proving for various kinds of theories, but in general verification procedures in all areas. Right, so in this case, the result is that subproblems are very much smaller, but there are more of them. And it's always a trade-off between having too many problems or too few. And we can actually use model assignments and answer proofs as hints for the refinement. And it turns out in practice that is often useful. Very quickly, we did some experiments where we can solve more problems than somebody else. This is what the scatter plot looks like. All the data points below the red axis or diagonal are data points where we are somewhere between 1 and 2 orders of magnitude faster than a previous approach. And on the right-hand side is a different comparison, also of our technique to some other one, where it's not so clear. There are some problems that the original solver called mathset times out. It's on the right-hand side axis. But there are also some where we are slower than them, which is on the left, to the left of the diagonal. Like I said, for unsatisfied problems, we don't have anything smart implemented. So we get pretty much 1 order of magnitude slowdown on the left. But we didn't care about that for now. And also the comparison to mathset is much worse than the other one. Right, there's a bunch of future directions from there. These are all projects that I've started to look at and that I'm going to work on in the next months and years. One example is this non-conservative kind of approximation where we don't know that we have implications between terms. That means we can use all kinds of incomplete solvers for all kinds of theories that have been developed over the last century. And there's quite a lot of them. Also, adding quantifiers is super important in real practical verification problems. You will see quantifiers very often, universal and existential quantification. And the resulting mathematical problems are very hard to solve. Many times the subtheory that we're looking at is undecidable, so we can't actually expect to get an answer if we had infinite time, but usually we have a very small time frame in practical problems. So there's a lot of stuff to do in that area. And in general, one of the themes of my current research is also to escape into higher complexity, which is counterintuitive, because usually we try to make problems easier and easier. Right? Try to take some very complicated problem, we try to boil it down to something that's very simple to decide for a machine. NP-complete problems are sort of on the order of that. Yeah, for many problems they're still decidable in practice, but for some theoretical, for example, they're really, really slow. But there is some indication that increasing the precision, increasing the expressivity of the logic you're working on allows you to get smaller proofs or models faster. One of these instances was where we looked at particular formulas that are, in fact, 2 NEXP time complete to decide. But we could still solve problems from QBF, which is P-space, complete on the right there. So there's about 3 orders of magnitude difference in complexity. But still, with the more expressive decision procedure, we could solve these problems faster than dedicated procedures for QBF. So there's some indication that this might be one solution to many practical problems of that sort. And I think I'm already way over time, so I'll stop here. Thank you.